The first object thrown across the room was a Bible. Not hurled dramatically like something from a Hollywood horror film. Not accompanied by thunder, screaming violins, or spinning heads. Just quietly lifted from a table in a small Portsmouth, Virginia home in the September of 1962. And thrown hard enough to strike the wall. Then came the scratching sounds, the knocks in empty rooms, furniture shifting during the night, dishes moving when nobody touched them. And according to the family living there, whatever haunted the house seemed strangely focused on one 13-year-old boy named Cleveland Harmon. Now, I should probably mention something important before we continue. My wife grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia, which means this story lands a little closer to home for me than most strange tales do. And this is real. You can go do an internet search on it and find things still out there. Interviews that were taken 50 years afterwards. But Portsmouth is one of those old tidewater cities where history never fully leaves the walls. Old neighborhoods, old churches, old naval stories, old cemeteries. And no matter how many streets they name after popular people who came up there, it's the kind of place where ghost stories don't feel imported. They feel inherited and passed down, like some kind of ragged heirloom that nobody knows why the family keeps doing it. But you do it anyway. And somewhere in Portsmouth's long collection of strange local tales sits one particularly unsettling case from 1962, involving a frightened family, a teenage boy, and a house that allegedly stopped behaving normally. Welcome back to Tavern Reflections. Pull up a chair, pour yourself something warm, and settle in beside the fire for tonight's reflection. Tonight, we wander into one of Virginia's stranger paranormal stories. A case involving flying objects, frightened witnesses, police investigations, a 13-year-old boy, and the uncomfortable possibility that some hauntings may have less to do with the dead and more to do with the living. Byron Savage once claimed fear is the most contagious force in any room. Poltergeist stories tend to prove him right. And I've been investigating these sort of things since the mid-1980s. I've searched, I've hunted, I've had people call me in the middle of the night or come rushing to my door just before the sunset, terrified and begging for help. And I've been looking into these things. I've had people bring me strange recordings with movements or voices that you couldn't hear until you turned the volume way up. If you enjoy strange stories, eerie reflections, weird folklore, and darker wanderings through the edges of reality, more strange doors await at TravisSivart.com. Now, let's head back to Portsmouth. Portsmouth, Virginia in 1962 was humid, busy, and old in a way that only East Coast cities can be old in the United States. Not ancient by European standards. Oh, not even close. But old enough that the streets carried layers. Naval history, war history, family history. The kind of city where generations remain close enough together for stories to linger longer than facts. Which is a gift of human beings, right? The Daughtry home sat within one of Portsmouth's ordinary residential neighborhoods. The ones that used to be new, but now were old. Not some isolated Victorian mansion with gargoyles and suspiciously lightning-friendly architecture. Though I do miss lightning rods. Just a house. That detail matters, because truly unsettling stories always happen in ordinary places. Places just like yours and mine. The family included Mrs. Charles Daughtry and her 13-year-old great-great-grandson, Cleveland Harmon. And sometime in September 1962, strange disturbances reportedly began inside the house. At first, the incident sounded almost explainable. Tapping sounds, scratching in the walls, objects shifting slightly. Anything that could have been mice or rats, the wind, houses settling after standing for a decade or 5. The sort of things people rationalize immediately because adulthood is mostly the art of pretending small, alarming things are probably fine. But the disturbances escalated. According to the reports retold through local legend, newspapers, and paranormal collections, objects began moving violently enough to attract attention from neighbors and eventually police. Accounts describe furniture shifting, household items flying, and disturbances centered around young Cleveland Harmon. That last detail matters enormously, because if you study poltergeist stories long enough, a pattern emerges. Again and again, the activity tends to cluster around adolescents, or, oddly enough, women going through menopause. Basically, when there's a large chemical surge and change within a human body, as the body adapts to that, it seems to cause psychic turmoil that can influence and affect the room around you, especially teenagers under emotional strain, especially in tense households where everything is already on edge, and especially during periods of instability. That pattern doesn't explain the events, but it does exacerbate them, complicate them. The Portsmouth disturbances reportedly became severe enough that people outside the immediate family witnessed unusual activity. Neighbors gathered, curiosity spread, and like most American paranormal stories from the 20th century, the case quickly became trapped somewhere between local gossip, fear, media attention, and genuine uncertainty. That mixture is dangerous. Fear grows fastest in crowded rooms. Now, it's important to be honest here. Many retellings of the Portsmouth Poltergeist story exaggerate details over time. That happens constantly with local hauntings. Stories evolve, each teller adds atmosphere, removes ambiguity, sharpens scenes. Ghost stories age the same way campfire tales do. They become more dramatic with survival, even stripped down to its most cautious version. This story remains unsettling because witnesses reportedly believed something genuinely strange was happening inside that house. And belief changes environments. It changes how we perceive things and experience things. I explain a lot of this in Chasing the Dark. The Daughtry home allegedly experienced objects thrown, Unexpectedly, unexplained noises, movement of household items, disturbances centered around Cleveland. At some point, fear stops being theatrical. It becomes environmental. It sinks into the bones of the place. The house itself begins changing emotionally. Every creak matters. Every silence stretches. Every shadow feels intentional. Once a room becomes psychologically charged enough, ordinary events stop feeling ordinary. That's one of the least supernatural but most terrifying aspects of the hauntings. Of any haunting. Fear changes the geometry of rooms. You enter differently and sit differently, listen differently. The walls themselves begin feeling emotionally loaded. I suspect anyone who's lived through intense family conflict understands this instinctively. Some houses feel exhausted. Some feel angry. Some feel grieving. And occasionally, some feel wrong. That word matters. Not haunted. Wrong. Reports from Portsmouth describe disturbances escalating enough that police were allegedly called to the house. Officers, and I say allegedly because it's hard to verify these things. You verify it more through old newspaper clippings than you do official police reports. I mean, this is 60 years ago. Officers reportedly witnessed enough unusual activity to leave uncertain or disturbed, though accounts vary heavily depending on the source. Now, personally, whenever police involvement appears in old paranormal stories, I become more simultaneously interested and more skeptical. Because police are still human beings, tired, suggestible, influenced by atmosphere. And once people inside a tense environments begin expecting strange events, the emotional temperature of the room changes dramatically. Cloud Source once described fear as a replicating signal transmitted through attention. He said a self-replicating signal transmitted through attention. That's how he described fear. Honestly, that may be one of the smartest things in my strange fictional universe he has ever said. Because fear spreads socially faster than almost anything else. One frightened person creates tension. 5 frightened people creates momentum. A frightened family surrounded by curious neighbors and uncertain authority figures inside a small house during a humid Virginia night in 1962. That creates pressure. And that pressure changes people. Perhaps even reality itself. The reports surrounding Cleveland Harmon grew increasingly uncomfortable, not because he appeared monstrous, but because the disturbances seemed to have attached to him. Again, that pattern appears constantly in poltergeist history. Young people, especially adolescents, especially emotionally overwhelmed adolescents. Some researchers have suggested that poltergeist phenomena may represent unconscious psychokinetic expression. I lean heavily in this direction myself. Stress, fear, repression, and emotional instability somehow externalized physically. Others argue the cases are so elaborate they're hoaxes. Attention-seeking behavior or social contagion amplified by fear and expectation, the retelling of the stories. And honestly, sometimes the answer may genuinely be all of the above. That's what makes these stories endure. Certainty never quite arrives. The Portsmouth case unfolded during a period when American interest in the paranormal was already growing rapidly. It was Roswell, not too much before this. Televisions had entered homes. Newspapers amplified strange stories quickly because they sold papers. Cold War paranoia shaped public psychology, feeding into that loop. Religion remained culturally dominant, and ghost stories traveled faster than ever before. A modern haunting goes viral online, and it's gone in a flash as quick as it came. It's hot for a minute, and then gone. A 1962 haunting spread through neighborhoods, diners, barbershops, churches, and newspaper columns. That older style of fear feels different somehow. Slower, stickier, more personal. You heard about it from someone who knew someone who had supposedly stood in the room. And somewhere inside those retellings, details survive because they emotionally resonate even if they can't be verified perfectly decades later. That's important because haunting stories are rarely preserved like court transcripts. They survive like folklore, emotion first, precision second. They want to draw the audience in. They're crafted that way over time. Some accounts claim objects flew through rooms. Others describe violent knocking sounds. Some insist Cleveland himself appeared terrified. Others imply suspicion toward him. That emotional ambiguity matters too, because poltergeist stories often trap These stories often trap adolescents in impossible positions. Either something supernatural is happening around them, or adults believe they are responsible for the terrifying events. And movies sell that newspaper to us every day. Neither option produces emotionally healthy teenagers. Imagine being 13 years old while adults whisper about you in frightened tones. What do you think that does to your head? Imagine neighbors gathering outside your home. Teenagers are already worried about what people think about them without any help. Imagine every dropped dish making people stare at you, whether you're in the room or not. Even if absolutely nothing paranormal occurred, the psychological environment, that becomes haunting. And maybe the horror hidden inside many poltergeist cases, not ghosts. That pressure, that domestic expectation amplified until reality itself begins feeling unstable. And once a family reaches that point, ordinary events stop behaving normally in memory. That's right. Things are remembered differently from how they actually happened. Because memory itself changes under fear. And people retelling things other people believe, even though they were right there beside the ones telling the story, they now believe that's what happened, even if it was different from what they experienced in the moment. There's another detail about poltergeist stories people rarely discuss honestly. Most are profoundly sad. Not exciting or adventurous. Sad. These stories almost always happen in emotionally strained homes, moving into a new place, brand new neighborhood, friends, schools, environments, financial pressure, family instability, adolescence, illness, grief, isolation. The haunting becomes a shape fear takes when language fails. Croker Nord supposedly once said, "Every haunting leaves fingerprints. Most belong to the living." That line feels painfully appropriate here. And Croker Norge investigated more hauntings in his years, in his stories, in his books, than most of us ever see in a whole lifetime. Because whether the Portsmouth disturbances were paranormal, psychological, exaggerated, misunderstood, or some complicated mixture of all four, something inside that house was undeniably, emotionally overheated. And humans are not designed to contain intense pressure indefinitely. Sometimes it leaks out through arguments, sometimes through silence, sometimes through nervous breakdowns, sometimes explosively, and occasionally through stories about furniture moving in the night. I think that's why poltergeist cases remain culturally fascinating despite skepticism. Not because everyone secretly believes in ghosts, not because everyone understands emotional pressure. Everyone understands houses that feel tense. Everyone understands fear spreading through small groups like smoke. Saw it as kids during sleepovers telling ghost stories, or campfires when you're camping out in your backyard or far out in the woods or swamps. And deep down, many people suspect reality itself may be thinner than it appears during moments of intense emotion. If anything thins the barrier between this world and another, it's intense emotion. The Portsmouth story survives because it sits exactly on that uncomfortable boundary. Too strange to dismiss entirely, too uncertain to confirm cleanly. The perfect habitat for folklore. Today, Portsmouth continues living its ordinary life. Traffic, neighborhoods, porches, naval history tours, restaurants, schools. People mowing lawns while humidity slowly attempts to murder from the atmosphere above and around them. Most residents likely never think about the Daughtry case at all. Most likely never even heard of it, don't even know it. But somewhere in the city's long memory, the story still lingers. A frightened family, a teenage boy, a house where things moved when they should not have, and a sudden end, or a quiet, sliding, invisible end to a story nobody could explain. Perhaps that's what all hauntings eventually become. Not proof, not evidence, memory residue. Stories communities continue carrying because they express emotional truths larger than the facts themselves. The reason poltergeist stories survive generation after generation is because they touch something deeply human beneath the supernatural framing. A house doesn't need a ghost to become haunted. Fear alone can accomplish astonishing things. Stress changes perception. Expectation sharpens coincidence into meaning. Anxious people laugh when they're frightened, and they begin listening differently, watching differently, interpreting differently, all while trying to brush it away with a nonchalance that stumbles and stutters. And once a family or group emotionally synchronizes around fear, ordinary reality can begin to feel unstable very quickly. That doesn't automatically explain flying objects or unexplained sounds or witnesses insisting they saw impossible things, but it does explain why these stories persist, even in skeptical cultures. Because poltergeist stories are rarely about death. They're about pressure. Pressure inside homes, inside people, inside the changes we naturally go through during our life, like adolescence. Teenagers exist in a particularly volatile emotional state also already. Identity is changing from childhood to becoming the person they'll be in their adulthood. Hormones are shifting, social fear exploding, and emotions arriving faster than language. And usually nobody to show them how to deal with them or direct them or harness them or learn from them. And historically, many poltergeist stories cluster around exactly that kind of emotional environment. Not because teenagers are secretly psychic demolition crews. No, honestly, some middle school cafeterias suggest otherwise. But because adolescence destabilizes households emotionally. We all deal with enough every day, all by ourselves, once you start adding these other things in the mix. Emotionally unstable environments begin interpreting reality through stress. Fear changes the geometry of ordinary rooms. That line may be the entire story. A creak becomes a warning. A knock becomes intention, suggesting what to come next. A moving object becomes evidence of something else, something more, something unseen. And sometimes communities reinforce those interpretations until the story gains a life stronger than the original event. See this in politics all the time. Or sports, when somebody retells the story of what they saw. Yet dismissing all such cases too aggressively misses something important too. Human beings are meaning-making creatures, and emotionally charged environments occasionally produce experiences difficult to explain cleanly. Maybe that explanation is psychological, maybe social, maybe neurological, maybe something stranger. But whatever happened in Portsmouth in 1962, the fear inside that house was real. And real fear leaves marks. It scars, even decades later. Thank you for spending part of your evening here in the tavern. If you enjoy strange stories, eerie reflections, old folklore, and darker wanderings through the edges of reality, more strange doors await at TravisSivart.com. Byron Savage would probably insist fear is humanity's oldest architect. Cloud Source would likely argue it's also our most efficient network. Personally, I think old houses simply remember too much. Until next time, mind the shadows. And be careful what kind of fear you invite into a room.